There are people who walk away from the modern world, and then there are people who build something in its place. Eustace Conway did not simply leave behind the noise of civilization. He carved out an entirely different existence with his own two hands, deep in the mountains of North Carolina, on hundreds of wild acres he called Turtle Island. He did not hire contractors. He did not follow blueprints drawn up by someone else. He looked at raw land and raw timber and raw possibility, and he got to work. For decades, he taught people how to live the way human beings once lived, close to the earth, dependent on nothing but skill, patience, and sheer unbreakable will. He built shelters from trees he felled himself. He grew food from soil he turned with his own hands. He welcomed thousands of visitors who arrived curious, sometimes skeptical, and left carrying something they hadn't expected to find. People admired him, followed him, called him a legend. And then, without any warning, something happened to Turtle Island that no one saw coming. The property he had given his entire adult life to building, the land he had sacrificed comfort and security and ordinary happiness for, was suddenly placed in serious jeopardy. Not by a wildfire tearing through the forest, not by a flood reshaping the land, not by anything the natural world which he had always respected and trusted could have thrown at him. What threatened to destroy everything Eustace Conway had built came from somewhere far more complicated. It came from a system he had deliberately, consciously, and defiantly chosen to live outside of. And the question that settled over everyone who knew his story became painfully simple. Could a man who had survived the wilderness for decades survive this? Eustace Conway is not a character someone invented. Though if you described his life to a stranger, they might reasonably assume otherwise. He is a real man, living a genuinely extraordinary life on a mountain homestead, who became known to millions through a best-selling book and a television series that tried its best to capture what he had created. Both fell slightly short, not because they were poorly made, but because some things resist being fully captured. Turtle Island was one of them, Eustace was another. The most fascinating thing about him was never the fame, never the cameras, never the admirers who drove hours just for the chance to stand on his land and shake his hand. The most fascinating thing was how much he was willing to risk, how much he was willing to lose. How completely and without apology he had organized his entire life around a belief that most people quietly share, but almost no one ever acts on. His story is one of fierce independence, quiet sacrifice, and an eventual confrontation with modern society that became far more dramatic than even he could have anticipated. This is not simply the story of a man who lives in the woods. This is the story of what happens when a life built entirely on principle collides head-on with a world that plays by completely different rules. Most children grow up being told to come inside when it gets dark. Eustace Conway was not most children, and the difference showed early. From the time he was very young, something inside him resisted the pull of comfort, of routine, of the carefully constructed suburban life that surrounded him like a cage he hadn't agreed to enter. He grew up in a home that, from the outside, looked entirely ordinary. His father was an educated man, formal and emotionally distant in the way that certain fathers are, and that distance left a mark on Eustace that quietly shaped everything that came after. But instead of turning that pain inward, Eustace turned outward, toward the woods behind the house, toward the fields and streams and unhurried corners of the natural world that most of his peers walked past every day without a second glance. By the time he was a young teenager, he had already started sleeping outside regularly, not as a dare, not as a boyhood adventure, but because something about the natural world felt more truthful to him, more alive, more honest than the walls of any house he had ever been asked to stay inside. He learned to identify plants by their shape and smell. He learned to track animals across ground that looked featureless to everyone else. He learned to start fire without matches, to read the weather written in the sky, to find clean water in places no one else would have thought to look. While his classmates were moving steadily toward the future that society had already mapped out for them, Eustace was moving in a different direction entirely, and he was doing it deliberately. He wasn't rebelling for the sake of rebellion. That distinction matters more than it might seem. He genuinely believed, with the kind of unshakable conviction that is rare even in much older people, that modern human beings had drifted far from something essential, something real, something they desperately needed and had stopped noticing they were missing. He wasn't bitter about it, he was driven by it. And then, while still a teenager, he did something that would stop most grown adults cold. He set out to travel across the country on horseback, covering thousands of miles, living as close to the land as he possibly could, carrying almost nothing that belonged to the modern world. He completed that journey. When he returned, the world around him looked exactly the same as when he had left, but Eustace Conway had changed in ways that nothing and no one could reverse. He had proven something to himself that no classroom and no textbook and no well-meaning mentor could ever have given him. He had proven that he could do it. That the skills he had spent years building weren't hobbies, weren't performances. They were a way of living fully and completely, entirely on his own terms. The land was calling. And he had already decided, long before anyone else understood what that meant, that he was going to answer. The dream was enormous, and it was specific, and he never once apologized for either of those things. Eustace Conway didn't want a small retreat cabin where he could disappear on weekends and return to ordinary life refreshed. He wanted something far more ambitious, something that had never quite been attempted in the way he was imagining it. He wanted to build a living school. A place where people, especially young people, could arrive and genuinely feel what it was like to exist without the cushioning of modern technology. Where they could learn to raise animals and build shelters and grow food and make fire and read the land beneath their feet, and somewhere inside all of that, discover something about themselves they hadn't been able to find anywhere else. He found the land he was looking for in the mountains of North Carolina. Hundreds of acres of wild, densely forested terrain that most people driving past would have seen as nothing in particular. Eustace saw everything. He called it Turtle Island, and then with his own hands he started building. What followed was years of extraordinary physical effort, of creative problem-solving that no manual covered, of stubborn, relentless determination that either destroys a person completely or forges them into something that cannot be easily broken. Eustace was forged. He built structures from timber he cut and shaped himself. He raised animals. He turned soil into crops. He cleared trails and created gathering spaces and teaching areas that slowly, almost imperceptibly, began to resemble the vision he had been carrying in his mind for years. And people started to hear about it. Word spread in the way that only truly remarkable things spread, not through advertising campaigns or carefully managed publicity, but through the oldest and most reliable method there is. People told other people, and those people told more people. Because what was happening at Turtle Island was something genuinely difficult to describe and even more difficult to dismiss once you had seen it for yourself. Visitors arrived and left changed in ways they struggled to articulate. Students came with skepticism and departed carrying something they couldn't name but couldn't stop thinking about. A writer named Elizabeth Gilbert, who would later tell her own story of transformation to the entire world, came to Turtle Island and spent time walking the land with Eustace. What she witnessed there became the foundation of a book called The Last American Man, which carried his story to a national audience in a way nothing else had managed. Suddenly, the man who had deliberately chosen to live far outside the spotlight found himself standing squarely in the center of it. And that, as it turned out, was only the beginning. When the television cameras eventually arrived, Eustace Conway was already a legend in certain circles. The kind of quiet legendary status that spreads not through media, but through the testimony of people who have experienced something they can't fully explain. The book had established his name. The reputation of Turtle Island had moved through communities of people who cared deeply about self-sufficiency, about environmental education, about the kind of direct hands-on learning that most traditional institutions had quietly abandoned decades ago. But television is an entirely different kind of attention, and it reaches entirely different people. The show that documented his life brought Eustace Conway into households across the country, and what audiences found there fascinated them in a way that was genuinely hard to explain. Here was a man who was not performing survival for entertainment. He was not doing it for competition or prize money or a contract renewal. He was simply living in a way that felt ancient and immediate and startlingly real, and somehow that was more compelling than almost anything else television was offering at the time. Viewers watched him rise before dawn to tend animals in weather that would have sent almost anyone else back under the covers. They watched him teach young people skills that their grandparents might have recognized, but their own parents had already forgotten. They watched him move through his land with a quiet confidence that can only be earned, never performed, never bought, never faked. He became, for many of the people watching, something more than a television personality. He became a mirror. People watched Eustace Conway and felt something stir in them, a question they hadn't known they were carrying. about what they were actually doing with their own lives, about what they had traded away for convenience, about what they might be capable of if the world ever truly demanded more from them. Turtle Island became a destination people planned trips around. Visitors drove for hours, sometimes from the far corners of the country, just to walk the land and meet the man and sit beside a fire and feel, even briefly, what it was like to exist somewhere that made a quiet kind of sense. Eustace gave interviews. He spoke at events. He was invited onto platforms that wanted to understand what exactly he represented to the people who followed him so devotedly. And through all of it, he remained almost stubbornly unchanged. Consistent, committed, grounded, he was not managing a brand, he was tending a place. There is a profound difference between those two things, and Eustace understood it better than almost anyone. But something was gathering quietly in the background. Something entirely separate from television audiences and best-selling books and the admiration of strangers. Something that would test everything he had ever built in a way he could not have fully prepared for. There is a particular kind of devastation that does not come from failure. It comes from having everything you have poured your life into suddenly placed in someone else's hands, judged by someone else's standards, measured against a ruler you never agreed to be measured by. That is what happened to Eustace Conway. The threat to Turtle Island did not arrive the way threats in the wilderness arrive, sudden and physical, and something you can face directly. It arrived quietly in paperwork. In the careful language of regulatory codes and inspection requirements and permitting processes. The machinery of a modern system that had its own precise ideas about how land could be used and what structures were acceptable and what standards had to be met before people could legally gather anywhere. The county came to Turtle Island. Inspectors walked the land and examined the structures that Eustace had built by hand over decades of his life. The shelters and teaching spaces and gathering areas that had welcomed and served thousands of visitors without a single serious incident. And what they found, measured against the codes they were legally required to enforce, did not comply. The structures were intentionally traditional, deliberately primitive. Built using ancient techniques rather than modern construction standards, because that was the entire philosophical foundation of what Turtle Island existed to teach. The point was not to replicate the modern world on a mountain. The point was to offer something entirely different from it. But the county did not evaluate philosophy. The county evaluated permits, safety codes, legal frameworks, and by every one of those measurements, Turtle Island fell outside the lines. The order came down. Turtle Island was to close. The place Eustace had given his entire adult life to building. The place that had genuinely changed the lives of thousands of people who passed through it. The place that represented every compromise he had refused to make and every sacrifice he had quietly accepted, shuddered. When the news reached the people who had visited Turtle Island, who had sent their own children there, who had followed his story through the book and the television show, and the deep, quiet admiration of someone doing something they themselves had never quite found the courage to attempt. The reaction came fast and it came hard. Many people felt the whole thing was profoundly unjust. That a man who had harmed no one, who had in fact built something genuinely valuable and rare, was being punished by a system that simply did not know how to make room for a life like his. Others argued the opposite, that regulations exist for real reasons, that safety standards apply to everyone regardless of their intentions or their philosophy. That Turtle Island was not above the law simply because its heart was in the right place. The debate grew into something larger than one man's property on one mountain. It became a conversation about freedom, about the deep and unresolved tension between individual vision and collective governance, about the real cost of living outside the lines that modern society has drawn around everyone whether they agreed to them or not. For Eustace Conway, it was not a conversation. It was the most concrete and immediate crisis of his life, and the question hanging over everything he had ever built was devastating in its simplicity. Could he save it? Eustace Conway did not walk away. Anyone who had paid real attention to his life would not have expected him to. But the nature of this particular fight was unlike anything the wilderness had ever asked of him. The wilderness demanded physical endurance, present-moment skill, and direct action. What saving Turtle Island demanded was something much harder for a man like Eustace to offer. Patience with a bureaucratic system he had spent his whole life working outside of. Sustained engagement with processes that moved at a pace completely alien to someone who had always lived close to the immediate rhythms of the natural world. He hired help. He found advocates who understood the legal landscape better than he did. He engaged with the process even when every instinct in him resisted it. He made structural changes where changes were possible. He worked toward compliance in every area where compliance could be achieved without gutting the very soul of what Turtle Island was built to be. It was not a clean resolution. It was not the kind of victory that feels completely satisfying or makes a neat ending to a story. Real life rarely offers those, and Eustace had always lived closer to real life than almost anyone. There were compromises that cost him something genuinely painful to give up. There were battles he won clearly, and others he didn't win the way he had hoped to. There were long stretches of genuine uncertainty, when it seemed entirely possible that the place he had devoted his life to might be permanently and irreparably changed. But Turtle Island survived. Not unchanged, not without scars that were real and visible, but standing still there, still his. And Eustace continued doing what he had always done, teaching people, tending the land. Welcoming anyone willing to make the journey and put in the work, and stay long enough to feel what the place had always offered. What the entire episode laid bare, more clearly than anything else in his long and remarkable story, was the fundamental tension that had always existed at the center of Eustace Conway's life. He had always believed that his way of living was more honest than what surrounded him. That the skills he practiced were not romantic hobbies, but genuine necessities that a distracted civilization had foolishly discarded without fully understanding what it was throwing away. But living outside the system, it turned out, had never meant living beyond its reach. The land he had claimed and cleared and built upon still existed inside a country, with laws and jurisdictions and enforcement mechanisms. The life he had constructed still intersected, at certain unavoidable points, with a world that had its own requirements and its own authority and its own timeline. What he created at Turtle Island was extraordinary in every sense of the word. The impact it had on the thousands of people who passed through it was real and lasting, and the kind of thing that resists easy measurement, but is completely impossible to dismiss once you have encountered it directly. He remains one of the most compelling and genuinely rare figures in any conversation about how human beings relate to the natural world. About what has quietly been surrendered in the long pursuit of comfort and convenience. About what it might actually feel like, in the body and in the mind and somewhere deeper than either. To live with more intention and more skill and more honest connection to the earth that everything ultimately depends upon. His story is not finished, the land is still there, the work continues, the fire is still lit. And the question his life asks of everyone who encounters it, whether they find it inspiring or unsettling or somewhere uncomfortably between the two, has not lost a single ounce of its power. Eustace Conway built something rare, a place that made people feel something they hadn't known they were missing and hadn't known how much they needed until they were standing inside it. He defended it when it was threatened. He navigated a world he had chosen to step outside of, played by rules he had never wanted to learn, and came through the other side still standing on the land he had given everything to protect. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, not loud or dramatic in the way that most extraordinary things are presented to us, just steady and stubborn and real. But it leaves behind a question that is worth sitting with honestly. In a world that accelerates every year, that adds more noise and more distance between people and the ground beneath their feet. What are we willing to fight for? And what have we already allowed to slip away without ever quite noticing it was going? So I want to hear from you. Do you think what happened to Turtle Island was a failure of the system? Or was it a necessary collision between two genuinely different ideas about how the world should work? And what would you have done if you had been standing in his place? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one waiting to be told, and every single one of them deserves to be heard.